The morning sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of Willowbrook Springs Community Church as construction worker Marcus David Thompson guided his jackhammer across the old wooden floor. It was a Tuesday in September 2023, and what should have been a routine renovation project was about to uncover secrets that had been buried for over 25 years beneath the sacred ground where hundreds had worshipped, prayed, and sought salvation. Marcus, a 43-year-old father of three with calloused hands and a strong faith, had been hired by the church board to replace the deteriorating floorboards in the main sanctuary. The building, constructed in 1952, had served the small Tennessee community of Willowbrook Springs faithfully for 7 decades, but time and countless church services had taken their toll on the original hardwood floors. "Be extra careful around the pulpit area," called out Elder Benjamin Charles Whitmore, a distinguished 67-year-old retired banker who had served on the church board for nearly 30 years. "That's where Pastor Hartwell used to deliver his most powerful sermons back in the day." Marcus nodded respectfully, wiping sweat from his brow as he thought about the legendary Pastor Jonathan Samuel Hartwell, who had shepherded this congregation from 1985 to 1998 before his sudden and mysterious departure. Even now, 25 years later, longtime members spoke of Pastor Hartwell in hushed, complicated tones, some with deep reverence for his powerful preaching and community service, others with questions that had never been fully answered about why such a beloved spiritual leader had vanished without explanation on a cold December night. As Marcus worked his way toward the pulpit area, the rhythmic pounding of his jackhammer suddenly changed tone. Instead of the solid thud of tool against wood and subflooring, he heard a hollow echo that shouldn't have been there. He stopped immediately, his experienced ear telling him something was unusual about the space beneath this particular section of floor. "Mr. Whitmore," Marcus called out, setting down his jackhammer and kneeling to examine the area more closely. "I think there might be some kind of hollow space under here. The sound is completely different from the rest of the floor." Elder Whitmore hurried over, his polished dress shoes clicking against the remaining floorboards. As the longest-serving member of the church board, he prided himself on knowing every inch of the building, but this discovery puzzled him greatly. "That can't be right," Whitmore said, consulting the architectural plans he carried in a worn leather folder. "According to these blueprints from 1952, there should be solid foundation and crawl space beneath the entire sanctuary. There's no indication of any kind of room or hollow area." Marcus tapped the floor with his hammer, listening carefully to the different sounds. "Sir, I've been in construction for 22 years, and I'm telling you there's definitely an empty space down there. It sounds like it might be fairly large, too, maybe the size of a small room." The two men looked at each other with growing curiosity and concern. Elder Whitmore had been present during every major renovation and repair project since becoming a board member in 1994, and he had never encountered anything like this. "Should we call Pastor Williams?" Marcus asked, referring to the current pastor, David Michael Williams, who had been leading the congregation since 2001. "Yes, absolutely," Whitmore replied, though his mind was already racing with questions. "But first, let's see if we can figure out exactly how large this space is." For the next hour, Marcus carefully tapped and tested different sections of the floor around the pulpit area. What they discovered was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. There appeared to be a rectangular space approximately 8 feet by 12 feet hidden beneath the floorboards, accessed by what seemed to be a concealed entrance near the base of the pulpit itself. Pastor David Williams arrived within 30 minutes of their phone call, accompanied by his wife, Susan Margaret Williams, and Elder Thomas Richard Pemberton, the current chairman of the church board. Pastor Williams, a gentleman of 51 with graying hair and kind eyes, had heard rumors over the years about unusual circumstances surrounding his predecessor's departure, but he had always attributed them to small-town gossip and the natural tendency of people to create mystery where none existed. "This is extraordinary," Pastor Williams said as Marcus demonstrated the hollow sound by tapping different areas of the floor. "In all my years here, no one has ever mentioned anything about a hidden room beneath the sanctuary." Elder Pemberton, a retired sheriff's deputy with sharp investigative instincts, examined the area with professional interest. "Marcus, how difficult would it be to remove enough floorboards to access whatever's down there?" "Not difficult at all," Marcus replied. The boards in this section are already loose from age and moisture. I could have a section removed within an hour, but I want to make sure everyone's comfortable with proceeding." Pastor Williams and his wife exchanged meaningful glances. Susan, a former teacher with a practical nature and strong intuition, had always sensed there were unresolved issues surrounding Pastor Hartwell's sudden departure. She had heard whispered conversations among the older church members, fragments of sentences that suggested all was not as it had seemed during those final months of Hartwell's ministry. "I think we need to know what's down there," Susan said quietly. "If there's something hidden beneath our church, we have a responsibility to discover what it is." After a brief discussion and a prayer asking for God's guidance and protection, the group decided to proceed. Marcus began carefully removing floorboards, working methodically to create an opening large enough for someone to safely descend into the hidden space. As the last board came away, they found themselves looking down into a small, man-made room illuminated by dusty shafts of afternoon sunlight streaming through the opening above. The room had concrete walls and appeared to have been professionally constructed, with electrical wiring running along the ceiling and what looked like ventilation pipes leading to unknown destinations. "There's a ladder built into the wall," Marcus observed, shining his flashlight into the space. This wasn't just some storage area that got covered over. Someone designed this room to be accessed secretly. Elder Whitmore's face had grown pale as he stared into the hidden chamber. "I need to call Margaret Elizabeth Thornton," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. She was Pastor Hartwell's secretary during his final years here. If anyone knows about this room, it would be Margaret. Pastor Williams descended into the chamber first, followed by Elder Pemberton and Marcus. What they found in that hidden room would forever change their understanding of Pastor Jonathan Samuel Hartwell and explain the mysterious circumstances that had surrounded his sudden disappearance 25 years earlier. The room was furnished as a private study, complete with a desk, filing cabinets, bookshelves, and a small cot. But it was the contents of the room that sent chills down their spines. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes documenting what appeared to be extensive surveillance of church members and community residents. There were detailed files on dozens of families, containing personal information that no pastor should have possessed, financial records, medical histories, family secrets, and what appeared to be evidence of various indiscretions and sins. On the desk sat several journals filled with Pastor Hartwell's handwriting, documenting years of what could only be described as psychological manipulation and spiritual abuse. The journals revealed a man who had used his position of trust and spiritual authority to control and exploit his congregation in ways that violated every principle of pastoral care and Christian love. "My God," whispered Pastor Williams as he opened one of the journals. What kind of man was Jonathan Hartwell? Elder Pemberton, drawing on his years of law enforcement experience, began systematically examining the evidence with professional detachment. "Gentlemen, what we're looking at here appears to be the workspace of someone who was engaged in extensive blackmail, manipulation, and abuse of his pastoral position." As they continued exploring the hidden room, they discovered filing cabinets filled with correspondence, photographs, and documents that painted a picture of Pastor Hartwell as a man who had systematically gathered compromising information about his congregation and used it to maintain control over their lives. There were records of financial contributions that appeared to have been coerced rather than freely given, documentation of personal counseling sessions that had been secretly recorded, and evidence that Hartwell had been selling confidential information to business competitors and political rivals in the community. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of photographs hidden in a locked drawer of the desk. The images showed various church members in compromising situations, apparently taken without their knowledge or consent. Some appeared to have been taken through windows of private homes, others in locations where people would have expected privacy and safety. Marcus Thompson, despite his years of construction work and exposure to all manner of human folly, found himself deeply shaken by what they were uncovering. "How could someone do this?" he asked. "How could a man who stood in the pulpit every Sunday and preached about love and forgiveness be capable of such evil?" Pastor Williams closed his eyes and said a silent prayer for wisdom and strength. As the current spiritual leader of this congregation, He felt the weight of responsibility for addressing the sins of his predecessor and helping his community heal from violations of trust that had been hidden for more than 2 decades. "We need to call the police," Elder Pemberton said firmly. "Even though the statute of limitations may have expired on some of these activities, there could be ongoing victims who deserve to know the truth. And we need to determine if Pastor Hartwell is still alive and still potentially dangerous to others." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of footsteps echoed from the sanctuary above. Margaret Elizabeth Thornton, now 78 years old and one of the most respected members of the church, had arrived in response to Elder Whitmore's urgent phone call. "Benjamin called and said you had found something unusual," Margaret's voice carried down through the opening in the floor. "May I come down and see what you've discovered?" The men exchanged glances, unsure whether Margaret should be exposed to the disturbing evidence they had uncovered. But her voice carried such authority and dignity that they instinctively trusted her ability to handle whatever they might reveal. Pastor Williams climbed up to help Margaret safely descend into the hidden room. At 78, she moved carefully but with determination, her keen mind still sharp despite her advancing years. Margaret had served as church secretary from 1985 to 2001, working closely with both Pastor Hartwell and Pastor Williams during the transition period. When Margaret saw the contents of the room, her reaction surprised everyone. Rather than shock or disbelief, her face showed an expression of sad confirmation, as if she had finally received answers to questions that had troubled her for decades. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 25 years of suppressed suspicions. "I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that I was being unfair to Pastor Hartwell, but I knew in my heart that something was terribly wrong with his ministry." She moved slowly around the room, examining the files and photographs with the careful attention of someone who had spent years managing church records and correspondence. "I remember now," she continued. "In the months before Pastor Hartwell disappeared, he had been spending unusual amounts of time in the church building after hours. I would sometimes come in early on Sunday mornings and find evidence that someone had been in the building late at night, coffee cups in the kitchen, lights left on, papers out of place on my desk." Margaret paused at the filing cabinet, running her fingers along the carefully labeled folders. "He told me he was working on a special project, something he called pastoral care enhancement. He said he was developing new ways to better serve our congregation's needs, but he was very secretive about it. When I offered to help, he became defensive and told me it was confidential work that required complete privacy." Elder Pemberton took careful notes as Margaret shared her memories. "Did you ever suspect that Pastor Hartwell might be engaged in anything illegal or unethical?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with difficult memories. "There were incidents," she said finally. "Phone calls that came to the church office asking for Pastor Hartwell, but when I would transfer them, I could hear raised voices and angry conversations through his closed door. People in the community began avoiding him in the grocery store and at public events. Several families left the church without explanation, which was unusual for our close-knit community." She picked up one of the journals from the desk and opened it carefully. "I remember the handwriting," she said sadly. "Pastor Hartwell used to dictate letters to me for church business, but he always wrote his personal correspondence and sermon notes by hand. This is definitely his writing." As Margaret read excerpts from the journal, the full scope of Pastor Hartwell's deception became clear. He had been using information gathered during private counseling sessions to manipulate church members into making large financial contributions. He had been selling personal information about community members to outsiders who wanted to gain business or political advantages. Most disturbing of all, he had been using compromising photographs and recorded conversations to blackmail people into silence about his activities. "The night he disappeared," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger as she shared long-buried memories, "I received a phone call at home around 11 o'clock. It was Pastor Hartwell, and he sounded terrified. He said there were people coming for him, people who were angry about something he had done. He told me to stay away from the church for a few days and to tell anyone who asked that he had gone on a personal retreat." Pastor Williams felt his heart breaking as he listened to Margaret's revelations. "Margaret, why didn't you tell anyone about this at the time?" Why did the church board not investigate his disappearance more thoroughly? Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to explain decisions made 25 years earlier. You have to understand the atmosphere at that time, she said. Pastor Hartwell was a powerful figure in our community. He had connections with political leaders, business owners, even law enforcement. People were afraid of him, even if they couldn't articulate exactly why. She gestured toward the evidence surrounding them in the hidden room. And look at what he had gathered about all of us. If he had this much compromising information about church members, imagine what he might have had on community leaders, police officers, city council members. People who might have been in positions to investigate his activities may have been afraid of what he might reveal about them. The group spent the rest of the afternoon carefully documenting everything in the hidden room before contacting law enforcement. Elder Pemberton used his experience in police work to ensure that the evidence was preserved properly, while Pastor Williams and Margaret began the difficult process of identifying the people whose privacy had been violated by Pastor Hartwell's surveillance and blackmail activities. As evening approached, they faced the challenging question of how to inform the congregation and the broader community about what they had discovered. Many of the people whose information had been compromised by Pastor Hartwell were still members of the church, still residents of Willowbrook Springs, still living with the consequences of violations they had never known had occurred. We have to tell them, Pastor Williams said as they sat in the hidden room, surrounded by evidence of their former pastor's crimes. These people have a right to know what was done to them. They deserve the opportunity to seek justice and healing. Margaret nodded slowly, though her face showed the weight of knowing how difficult the revelations would be for the community. Some of these families have been carrying shame and guilt for 25 years, believing that Pastor Hartwell's disappearance was somehow their fault. They need to know the truth about what kind of man he really was. As they prepared to leave the hidden room and begin the process of revealing Pastor Hartwell's crimes to the world, Marcus Thompson made one final discovery that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of the former pastor's activities. Hidden behind a loose brick in the wall was a small metal box containing what appeared to be Pastor Hartwell's escape plan. Inside the box were false identification documents, several $1,000s in cash, and a detailed map of routes leading to Mexico and Canada. There were also letters addressed to contacts in various cities, suggesting that Pastor Hartwell had been planning his disappearance for months before he actually vanished. Most significantly, there was a confessional letter in Pastor Hartwell's handwriting, apparently written as insurance in case his activities were discovered before he could escape. The letter provided a full confession of his crimes and named accomplices who had helped him gather information and maintain his network of surveillance and blackmail. He was planning to run, Elder Pemberton observed as he examined the contents of the metal box. This wasn't a spontaneous disappearance. He knew his activities would eventually be discovered, and he had been preparing for months to vanish without a trace. The confessional letter also revealed that Pastor Hartwell had not been working alone. Several prominent members of the community, including a city council member, a bank president, and even a deputy sheriff, had been part of his network of information gathering and manipulation. The letter suggested that these accomplices had helped Pastor Hartwell access private records, monitor telephone conversations, and maintain surveillance on targeted individuals. As darkness fell over Willowbrook Springs that Tuesday evening, the small group emerged from the hidden room carrying evidence that would forever change their understanding of their church's history and their community's past. They had uncovered not just the crimes of one corrupt pastor, but a network of corruption that had touched many of the most trusted institutions in their town. Pastor Williams called an emergency meeting of the church board for the following evening, while Elder Pemberton contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to report their discoveries. Margaret Elizabeth Thornton went home to her small apartment and spent the night in prayer, asking God for wisdom and strength for the difficult days ahead. The investigation that followed would reveal that Pastor Jonathan Samuel Hartwell's network of surveillance and blackmail had affected over 200 residents of Willowbrook Springs during his 13 years of ministry. Some had been coerced into making large financial contributions to the church, others had been forced to support political candidates or business ventures against their will, and many had lived for years under the threat of having their private information exposed if they spoke out against the pastor's activities. The hidden room beneath the church floor had been constructed in 1987, 2 years after Pastor Hartwell's arrival, as part of what church records described as foundation improvements and pastoral office enhancement. The construction had been done by a company owned by one of Hartwell's accomplices, ensuring that knowledge of the room's existence was limited to those who were part of the criminal network. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Catherine Brennan of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation led the formal investigation into Pastor Hartwell's crimes. An experienced investigator with a background in financial fraud and organized crime, Lieutenant Brennan quickly recognized that what they were dealing with was far more sophisticated than a simple case of pastoral misconduct. "What we're seeing here," Lieutenant Brennan explained to Pastor Williams and the church board during their first official interview, "is a systematic criminal enterprise that used religious authority and community trust as cover for extensive blackmail, fraud, and privacy violations." Pastor Hartwell wasn't just a corrupt minister, he was the leader of an organized criminal network. The investigation revealed that Pastor Hartwell's network had connections to similar operations in other small towns throughout Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia. The false identification documents found in his escape kit led investigators to discover that Jonathan Samuel Hartwell was itself a false identity, and that the man who had led Willowbrook Springs Community Church for 13 years was actually named Robert Allen Morrison, a former insurance investigator who had been forced to leave his previous career due to ethical violations. Lieutenant Brennan's team discovered that Morrison had been operating similar schemes in at least 4 other communities over a 20-year period, always using his position as a trusted religious or community leader to gain access to private information that could be used for blackmail and manipulation. Each time his activities were in danger of being discovered, he would disappear and reinvent himself in a new location. "The pattern is always the same," Lieutenant Brennan explained. "He arrives in a small, tight-knit community and quickly establishes himself as a charismatic, caring leader. He gains the trust of local families and begins offering counseling services, financial advice, and spiritual guidance. Over time, he gathers compromising information about community members and uses it to build a network of control and influence." The investigation also revealed that several of Pastor Hartwell's accomplices were still living in Willowbrook Springs, including retired bank president Charles Edward Blackwood and former city council member Patricia Rose Fitzgerald. Both had been secretly working with Hartwell to access private financial records and gather intelligence about community members for more than a decade. As news of the investigation spread throughout the community, dozens of residents came forward with their own stories of suspicious interactions with Pastor Hartwell and his associates. Many described feeling manipulated or coerced during what they had believed were routine pastoral counseling sessions. Others revealed that they had made large financial contributions to church projects that had never been completed, or had supported political candidates they didn't really favor after receiving advice from their trusted pastor. The psychological impact on the community was profound. Many church members struggled with feelings of betrayal, shame, and confusion about how they could have been so thoroughly deceived by someone they had trusted with their deepest secrets and most personal concerns. The revelation that their former pastor had been secretly recording their private conversations and photographing them without consent left many feeling violated and vulnerable. Pastor Williams found himself in the difficult position of helping his congregation heal from trauma while also serving as a witness in a major criminal investigation. He organized special counseling services for church members who had been affected by Pastor Hartwell's crimes, and he worked with community mental health professionals to provide support for those who were struggling with the psychological impact of the revelations. Healing from this kind of betrayal takes time, Pastor Williams told his congregation during a special service dedicated to addressing the crisis. We have to remember that the actions of one corrupt individual do not diminish the reality of God's love or the importance of our faith community. We will get through this together, with God's help and by supporting one another. Susan Williams, drawing on her background in education and counseling, organized support groups for women who had been particularly affected by Pastor Hartwell's violations of privacy and trust. Many of the female church members had confided in Pastor Hartwell about personal struggles, family problems, and intimate concerns, never imagining that their words were being recorded and their trust was being exploited. "The hardest part," said Elizabeth Catherine Morrison, no relation to the false pastor, a 64-year-old church member who had served on various committees during Pastor Hartwell's tenure, is wondering what he knew about me, what he might have recorded, what he might have shared with others. I trusted him with information about my marriage, my children, my fears and hopes. To learn that he was using that trust as a weapon against me and others is almost unbearable. The investigation continued for 18 months, ultimately resulting in charges against 12 individuals who had been part of Pastor Hartwell's criminal network. While the statute of limitations had expired on many of the crimes committed during the 1980s and 1990s, investigators were able to file charges related to ongoing financial fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering activities that had continued even after Hartwell's disappearance. The search for Pastor Hartwell himself, or Robert Allen Morrison, his real identity, led investigators across 3 countries and involved cooperation with international law enforcement agencies. The trail eventually led to a small coastal town in Mexico, where Morrison had been living under yet another false identity as a real estate developer and community volunteer. When Mexican authorities arrested Morrison in December 2024, he was 68 years old and had been living quietly in Puerto Vallarta for nearly 20 years. He had married a local woman, had 2 adult stepchildren, and was widely respected in his adopted community for his charitable work and generous donations to local schools and hospitals. The man who was extradited back to Tennessee bore little resemblance to the charismatic Pastor Jonathan Samuel Hartwell who had once commanded the respect and devotion of Willowbrook Springs Community Church. Morrison was gray-haired, stooped with age, and seemed genuinely surprised that his crimes from decades earlier had finally caught up with him. "I thought all of that was behind me," Morrison told investigators during his initial interrogation. "I've been living an honest life in Mexico for 20 years. I've done good work there, helped a lot of people. I'm not the same man I was when I was in Tennessee." Lieutenant Brennan, who had spent nearly 2 years investigating Morrison's crimes, was unmoved by his claims of redemption. "Mr. Morrison, your criminal activities in Willowbrook Springs affected over 200 people. Many of them have spent the last 25 years wondering what they did wrong, why their trusted pastor abandoned them, whether they were somehow responsible for your disappearance. Your victims deserve justice, regardless of how you've chosen to spend the last 2 decades. The trial of Robert Allen Morrison, alias Pastor Jonathan Samuel Hartwell, began in September 2025 and lasted for 3 months. The prosecution presented evidence of systematic fraud, blackmail, invasion of privacy, and abuse of religious authority that had affected an entire community for more than a decade. Morrison's defense team argued that their client had been suffering from mental health issues during his time in Willowbrook Springs, that he had made efforts to rehabilitate himself during his years in Mexico, and that the statute of limitations had expired on most of the alleged crimes. They portrayed Morrison as a man who had lost his way but had found redemption through his charitable work in his adopted country. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael James Patterson, focused on the systematic nature of Morrison's crimes and the lasting impact they had on his victims. Over 40 residents of Willowbrook Springs testified during the trial, describing how Morrison's violations of trust had affected their lives, their relationships, and their faith. Margaret Elizabeth Thornton, now 79 and still sharp despite her advanced age, was one of the most compelling witnesses. She testified about the atmosphere of fear and control that had pervaded the church during Morrison's final years, and about the suspicious activities she had observed but had been too frightened to report at the time. Pastor Hartwell, or Morrison, as we now know his real name, was a master manipulator, Margaret testified. He created an environment where people were afraid to question his authority or speak out about things that didn't seem right. He used our faith against us, used our trust as a weapon to control and exploit us. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and violations of federal privacy laws. Morrison was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with additional state charges still pending in Kentucky and Georgia where investigators had uncovered evidence of similar criminal activities. During the sentencing hearing, Morrison was given the opportunity to address his victims. After conferring with his attorneys, he chose to make a statement that surprised many who were present in the courtroom. "I have spent 25 years trying to run from what I did in Willowbrook Springs," Morrison said, his voice barely audible as he spoke into the microphone. I told myself that I had changed, that I had become a better person, that my good works in Mexico somehow balanced out the harm I had caused in Tennessee. But sitting in this courtroom, listening to the testimony of the people I hurt, I realized that I have been lying to myself just as I lied to all of you. He turned to face the section of the courtroom where many of his former victims were seated. I cannot undo the damage I caused to your lives, your families, and your faith. I cannot give back the years you spent wondering what you had done wrong or why your trusted pastor had abandoned you. But I can tell you that none of what happened was your fault. You were good, faithful people who deserved better than what I gave you. Morrison paused, clearly struggling with emotion before continuing. I ask not for your forgiveness, because I know that many of you cannot and should not forgive what I did. I ask only that you believe me when I say that I am truly sorry for the pain I caused, and that I hope my punishment will help you find some measure of peace. The response from the Willowbrook Springs community was mixed. Some felt that Morrison's statement was too little, too late, while others found a degree of closure in finally hearing an acknowledgement of the harm that had been done. Most agreed that justice had been served, even if it had taken 25 years to achieve. Pastor Williams, who had attended every day of the trial to support his congregation members who were testifying, offered his own reflection during the prayer service that followed the sentencing. We have witnessed God's justice today, he told the packed sanctuary. Not the quick, dramatic justice we sometimes wish for, but the slow, steady justice that comes when truth finally prevails over deception. He stood in the same pulpit where Morrison had delivered hundreds of sermons, in the same sanctuary where the hidden room had been discovered just 2 years earlier. The room beneath our floor is empty now, Pastor Williams continued. It has been cleansed and sealed, never again to hide secrets or harbor deception. But the lessons we have learned from what was hidden there will remain with us forever. The sanctuary had been completely renovated following the discovery of Morrison's crimes, with new flooring, updated electrical systems, and enhanced security measures. The hidden room itself had been filled with concrete and sealed permanently, with a small memorial plaque installed in the floor above it reading, "Truth will come to light." Luke 8 verse 17-inch. Margaret Elizabeth Thornton, who had played such a crucial role in helping investigators understand Morrison's crimes, was honored by the church with a special recognition service on the 2nd anniversary of the discovery. Despite her advanced age, she continued to serve as an unofficial historian for the congregation, helping newer members understand the full scope of what their community had endured and overcome. The most important thing we learned, Margaret told the assembled congregation during her recognition service, is that no human being, no matter how charismatic or seemingly holy, should ever be trusted with absolute authority over our lives or our faith. We must always remain vigilant, always ask questions, always remember that true spiritual leadership serves others rather than exploiting them. The case of Pastor Jonathan Samuel Hartwell became a landmark in discussions about religious authority, accountability, and the protection of vulnerable community members. Several theological seminaries added the Willowbrook Springs case to their curriculum as an example of how unchecked pastoral power can lead to systematic abuse and exploitation. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation used lessons learned from the Morrison investigation to develop new protocols for investigating crimes that occur within religious organizations. Lieutenant Brennan, who had led the investigation, became a national expert on religious fraud and spoke frequently at law enforcement conferences about recognizing and investigating crimes that exploit spiritual authority. 3 years after Morrison's conviction, the Willowbrook Springs Community Church had not only recovered from the trauma of discovering their former pastor's crimes but had grown stronger and more united than ever before. The congregation had increased to over 400 active members, many drawn by Pastor Williams' authentic, transparent leadership style and the community's reputation for resilience and mutual support. The church had also established the Truth and Transparency Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping other religious communities develop safeguards against pastoral abuse and exploitation. The foundation provided training, resources, and support for churches seeking to create accountability systems that would prevent future incidents like those that had occurred in Willowbrook Springs. Susan Williams had become a recognized expert in helping communities heal from institutional betrayal, traveling throughout the Southeast to lead workshops and support groups for congregations dealing with similar challenges. Her work was informed not only by her professional training but by her personal experience of helping her own church family navigate the complex emotions of betrayal, justice, and forgiveness. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, Susan often told the groups she worked with. It means learning to carry the truth of what happened without letting it poison your ability to trust, to love, and to believe in the goodness that still exists in the world. The hidden room beneath the church floor had revealed terrible secrets, but it had also revealed the strength and resilience of a faith community that refused to be destroyed by one person's evil actions. The people of Willowbrook Springs had learned that true faith is not dependent on perfect leaders, but on their commitment to support one another and to seek truth even when it is painful. As Pastor Williams often reminded his congregation, the most terrifying thing they had found in that secret room was not the evidence of Pastor Hartwell's crimes, but the realization of how much damage one person could do when given unchecked authority and unquestioning trust. The most beautiful thing they had discovered was their own capacity to face the truth, seek justice, and rebuild their community on a foundation of transparency, accountability, and genuine love. On quiet Sunday mornings, when sunlight streamed through the same stained glass windows that had illuminated Marcus Thompson's construction work 3 years earlier, Pastor Williams would sometimes pause during his sermons and reflect on the journey his congregation had traveled together. They had faced the darkest chapter in their church's history with courage and faith, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to living out the true principles of their Christian faith. The secret room was gone, sealed forever beneath concrete and marked only by a simple plaque that reminded all who entered that truth, no matter how long buried, would eventually come to light. But the lessons learned in that room would continue to guide the Willowbrook Springs Community Church for generations to come, ensuring that never again would their trust be exploited or their faith be used as a weapon against them. In the end, what had been discovered beneath the church floor was indeed terrifying, but what had been revealed about the power of truth, justice, and community resilience was truly miraculous. Epilogue, 5 years later. 5 years after the discovery of the secret room, Marcus David Thompson stood once again in the sanctuary of Willowbrook Springs Community Church, but this time he wore a suit instead of work clothes. He had been invited to speak at the church's annual Truth and Reconciliation Sunday, a service established to commemorate the anniversary of the discovery and to remind the congregation of the importance of transparency and accountability in all aspects of church life. When I first heard that hollow sound under the floorboards, Marcus told the packed sanctuary, I never imagined it would lead to such a complete transformation of our community. I was just a construction worker doing a job, but God used my hammer and my ears to uncover truth that had been hidden for decades. The congregation, now numbering over 500 regular attendees, listened intently as Marcus shared his perspective on the events that had changed their church forever. Many of the faces in the pews were new, families who had been drawn to Willowbrook Springs Community Church specifically because of its reputation for transparency, accountability, and healing from institutional betrayal. Pastor David Williams, now 56, and showing the gray hair that comes with shepherding a congregation through crisis and recovery, smiled as he watched Marcus speak. The relationship between the two men had deepened significantly over the years, as Marcus had become not only a trusted member of the congregation but also a powerful advocate for other communities dealing with similar discoveries of institutional corruption. The thing that struck me most, Marcus continued, wasn't the evil we found in that room, though that was certainly shocking. What struck me was how quickly this community came together to face the truth, seek justice, and begin the work of healing. You could have tried to cover it up, could have decided it was too painful to deal with, but instead you chose courage over comfort. In the front row sat Margaret Elizabeth Thornton, now 83 and moving more slowly but still possessing the sharp mind and strong spirit that had made her such a crucial witness in the investigation. Beside her sat her great niece, Jennifer Marie Thornton, a 28-year-old seminary student who had been inspired by her great-aunt's courage to pursue a career in ministry focused on institutional accountability and pastoral ethics. Aunt Margaret taught me that silence in the face of wrongdoing is not loyalty, it's complicity, Jennifer had written in her senior thesis at Memphis Theological Seminary. Her willingness to speak the truth about Pastor Morrison's crimes, even decades after the fact, showed me what real faithfulness looks like. The investigation and trial of Robert Allen Morrison had indeed become a landmark case in religious law and ethics. Law schools throughout the Southeast now taught courses that included the Willowbrook Springs case as an example of how communities could hold religious leaders accountable while still maintaining their faith and rebuilding their institutions. Dr. Patricia N. Richardson, a professor of religious studies at Vanderbilt University, had spent 3 years studying the aftermath of the Morrison case for a book titled Sacred Trust Betrayed: Healing Communities After Religious Abuse. Her research had included extensive interviews with church members, community leaders, and the investigators who had worked on the case. What makes Willowbrook Springs unique, Dr. Richardson explained during a presentation at the American Academy of Religion annual conference, is not that religious abuse occurred there. Sadly, that happens far too often. What makes it unique is how the community responded. Instead of fragmenting or closing ranks to protect their institution, they chose transparency, accountability, and genuine healing. The Truth and Transparency Foundation established by the church had grown into a nationally recognized organization, with Susan Williams serving as its executive director. The foundation had helped over 200 religious communities develop accountability systems, investigate suspicious activities, and heal from institutional betrayal. Susan's work had taken her from small rural churches to large urban congregations, but the principles she taught remained the same. Healing requires truth-telling, Susan would explain to groups of religious leaders and lay members. You cannot heal what you will not acknowledge, and you cannot prevent future abuse if you're unwilling to examine how it happened in the first place. The foundation's offices were housed in a renovated building just 2 blocks from Willowbrook Springs Community Church, and the walls were lined with thank you letters from communities that had been helped by the organization's resources and support. Many of the letters told stories remarkably similar to what had happened in Willowbrook Springs: trusted leaders who had abused their authority, communities that had struggled with how to respond, and ultimately the difficult but necessary work of seeking truth and justice. One letter that held special meaning for Susan came from a small Methodist church in rural Alabama where the pastor had been embezzling funds for over a decade. Your foundation gave us the courage to face the truth about our pastor's crimes, the letter read. More importantly, you showed us that admitting we had been deceived didn't mean we were foolish or that our faith was invalid. You helped us understand that being victimized by a corrupt leader doesn't make us failures as Christians. Back in Willowbrook Springs, the economic impact of the church's growth had been significant for the small community. New restaurants, shops, and service businesses had opened to serve the increasing number of visitors who came to learn about the church's story and the Truth and Transparency Foundation's work. The town's population had grown by nearly 30% since 2023, with many new residents citing the community's commitment to ethical leadership and accountability as factors in their decision to move there. Mayor Rebecca Louise Henderson, no relation to the construction company family that had aided Morrison's crimes, had been elected in 2024 on a platform of transparency and community engagement. Her administration had implemented strict ethical guidelines for all city employees and contractors, and had established an independent oversight committee to investigate complaints about municipal government operations. The church's example showed us that facing difficult truths makes institutions stronger, not weaker, Mayor Henderson explained during a city council meeting. We've tried to apply those same principles to city government, and I believe our community is better for it. The economic growth had also allowed the city to invest in infrastructure improvements, including a new community center that housed meeting rooms for support groups and educational programs. The center had become a gathering place for people throughout the region who were dealing with institutional betrayal, family trauma, and other challenges that required community support. Dr. Michael Anthony Stevens, a licensed clinical psychologist who had relocated to Willowbrook Springs specifically to work with the Truth and Transparency Foundation, had established a practice that specialized in helping individuals and communities heal from religious trauma. His waiting room was always full, not just with local residents but with people who traveled from hundreds of miles away to work with someone who understood the unique challenges of maintaining faith while recovering from religious abuse. Religious trauma is particularly complex, Dr. Stevens explained to a group of mental health professionals during a training workshop. When the institution that's supposed to provide spiritual comfort and guidance becomes a source of harm, it can shatter a person's entire worldview. The work we do here in Willowbrook Springs helps people understand that their faith and their betrayal by religious leaders are separate issues. One of Dr. Stevens' most successful programs was a weekly support group for adults who had experienced childhood religious trauma. The group met in the basement of the community center, in a room decorated with soft lighting and comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. The participants included former members of Willowbrook Springs Community Church who had been children during Morrison's tenure, as well as people from other communities who had experienced similar abuse. For 30 years, I blamed myself for my family leaving the church, shared Thomas William Carpenter, a 45-year-old accountant whose family had been among those who had left Willowbrook Springs Community Church abruptly in 1994. I thought something I had done or said had caused Pastor Hartwell to be angry with us. Learning that he was actually a criminal who was manipulating and blackmailing people helped me understand that our family's departure wasn't about anything I had done wrong. The support group had become so successful that Dr. Stevens had trained facilitators to lead similar groups in other communities. The model developed in Willowbrook Springs was now being used in over 30 cities across the Southeast, providing support for hundreds of people who were working to heal from religious trauma. Lieutenant Sarah Catherine Brennan had retired from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation in 2026, but she continued to work as a consultant on cases involving religious fraud and institutional abuse. Her expertise in the Morrison case had made her one of the most sought-after investigators in the country for complex cases involving trusted community leaders who had abused their positions. The Morrison case taught me that these criminals often operate for years or even decades before they're discovered, Lieutenant Brennan explained during an interview for a documentary about religious fraud. They're skilled manipulators who understand how to exploit trust and authority. But they also make mistakes, and when communities are willing to ask hard questions and demand accountability, the truth eventually comes out. The documentary, titled Beneath the Sacred Floor, The Willowbrook Springs Story, had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and had subsequently been broadcast on PBS stations nationwide. The film followed the investigation from Marcus Thompson's initial discovery through Morrison's conviction and the community's ongoing healing process. The documentary had been particularly effective in educating other communities about the warning signs of pastoral abuse and the importance of implementing accountability systems before problems occurred. Churches throughout the country had organized screenings of the film followed by discussions about their own governance structures and accountability measures. One of the most powerful segments of the documentary featured interviews with Morrison's victims describing how they had been manipulated and exploited. Elizabeth Catherine Morrison, who had legally changed her name to distance herself from any association with the false pastor, spoke eloquently about the long-term impact of having her trust violated by someone she had considered a spiritual father. Pastor Morrison didn't just steal money or invade our privacy, she said in the film. He stole our ability to trust spiritual authority. He made us question our own judgment and our own faith. That kind of damage takes years to repair, and some people never fully recover from it. The documentary also featured an interview with Morrison himself, conducted in federal prison where he was serving his sentence. The interview had been arranged after months of negotiations with prison officials and Morrison's attorneys, and it provided a rare glimpse into the mindset of someone who had systematically abused religious authority. I told myself I was helping people, Morrison said during the interview, his voice flat and emotionless. I convinced myself that gathering information about congregation members would help me serve them better, that knowing their secrets would allow me to provide more effective pastoral care. But the truth is, I was addicted to the power it gave me over their lives. When asked why he had chosen to target religious communities specifically, Morrison's answer was chilling in its honesty. Religious people want to trust their leaders, he said. They're taught that questioning authority is a sign of weak faith. They're predisposed to give you the benefit of the doubt, to make excuses for behavior that would be clearly unacceptable in any other context. It's an ideal environment for someone who wants to manipulate and control others. The interview segment had been particularly difficult for many viewers, especially those who had been victimized by religious leaders. But mental health experts noted that hearing Morrison explain his tactics had actually been helpful for many survivors, as it validated their experiences and helped them understand that the manipulation they had experienced was deliberate and systematic rather than accidental or imagined. Back in Willowbrook Springs, the church had established an annual scholarship program in honor of the victims of Morrison's crimes. The Margaret Elizabeth Thornton Scholarship for Ethical Leadership was awarded each year to a seminary student who demonstrated a commitment to transparency, accountability, and serving vulnerable populations. The scholarship had been funded through donations from across the country, as people who had been inspired by the church's story wanted to support efforts to train ethical religious leaders. The first recipient of the scholarship had been Jennifer Marie Thornton, Margaret's great-niece, who had used the funding to complete her Master of Divinity degree with a concentration in pastoral ethics and community healing. Jennifer was now serving as an associate pastor at a Presbyterian church in Nashville, where she had implemented many of the accountability practices she had learned from studying the Willowbrook Springs case. The scholarship isn't just about honoring those who were hurt by Pastor Morrison, Jennifer explained during the scholarship presentation ceremony. It's about investing in leaders who will make sure this kind of abuse never happens again. Every pastor, every church board member, every religious leader needs to understand that they are accountable to their communities and to God for how they use their authority. The scholarship program had also inspired other communities to establish similar initiatives. Churches that had experienced their own cases of pastoral abuse had created scholarship funds, mentoring programs, and training initiatives designed to promote ethical leadership and prevent future abuse. As the 5th anniversary of the discovery approached, Pastor Williams found himself reflecting on the profound changes that had occurred in his church and community. The congregation that had once numbered fewer than 300 members and struggled with the hidden trauma of Morrison's abuse had grown into a thriving community of over 500 people who were actively engaged in promoting justice, healing, and accountability both locally and nationally. The physical building had been completely transformed as well. The sanctuary where Morrison had once delivered his manipulative sermons had been renovated with new windows that filled the space with natural light, symbolizing the transparency that had replaced the secrecy of the Morrison years. The hidden room where Morrison had conducted his surveillance operations had been sealed with concrete and covered with a memorial plaque, but the lessons learned from its discovery continued to guide the church's operations. The church's governance structure had also been completely overhauled. The board now included rotating members from the congregation, with term limits to prevent any individual from accumulating too much power. All financial transactions were reviewed by an independent auditing firm, and the church's books were open for inspection by any member who requested access. Pastoral accountability measures included regular reviews by an external denominational body and a grievance procedure that allowed congregation members to report concerns without fear of retaliation. We learned that accountability isn't about distrust, Pastor Williams explained during a seminary class he taught on pastoral ethics. It's about creating systems that protect both the congregation and the pastor from the temptations and pressures that can lead to abuse of authority. These systems benefit everyone involved. The seminary where Pastor Williams taught had actually restructured its entire curriculum based on lessons learned from the Morrison case and similar incidents. All students were now required to take courses in ethics, boundary setting, and accountability systems. They also participated in supervised internships that included training on recognizing and preventing abuse of pastoral authority. Professor Williams had become a leading voice in the movement to reform theological education, arguing that seminaries had a responsibility to prepare students not just for the spiritual aspects of ministry but also for the practical and ethical challenges they would face as leaders of religious communities. For too long, we've treated pastoral ethics as a secondary concern, Professor Williams wrote in an article published in the Journal of Theological Education. We've focused on teaching students to preach and provide pastoral care, but we haven't adequately prepared them to handle the power and authority that comes with religious leadership. The Morrison case shows us what can happen when we fail in that responsibility. As Marcus Thompson concluded his remarks during the 5th annual Truth and Reconciliation Sunday service, he looked out at the congregation that had become his spiritual family and reflected on the journey they had all taken together. What had begun as a routine construction project had become a transformation that touched every aspect of their community life. I want to leave you with this thought, Marcus said as he prepared to return to his seat. The secret room we discovered beneath this floor was terrifying because it showed us how much damage one person can do when they abuse the trust placed in them. But it was also a gift, because it forced us to confront hard truths and make difficult changes that have ultimately made our church and our community stronger. He gestured toward the memorial plaque that marked the location of the former hidden room. We can't change what Pastor Morrison did to this community. We can't undo the harm he caused or give back the years that people spent living under his manipulation and control. But we can honor the victims of his crimes by making sure it never happens again. We can create the kind of community where truth is valued over comfort, where accountability is seen as a form of love, and where no one person is ever again given unchecked power over others. The congregation rose in sustained applause as Marcus returned to his seat, but the moment that followed was one of quiet reflection. These 5 years had been a journey of discovery, pain, healing, and growth that had transformed not just their church but their entire understanding of what it meant to be a faith community. Pastor Williams concluded the service with a prayer that had become traditional for Truth and Reconciliation Sunday, a prayer that acknowledged both the pain of the past and the hope for the future. Almighty God, we thank you for the gift of truth, even when it is painful to receive. We thank you for the courage to face difficult realities and the strength to seek justice for those who have been wronged. Help us to continue building a community based on transparency, accountability, and genuine love for one another. May the lessons we have learned from our past guide us toward a future worthy of your calling. And may those who come after us find in our example the courage to speak truth, seek justice, and choose healing over hiding. In Christ's name we pray, Amen. As the congregation filed out of the sanctuary that Sunday morning, many paused to look at the memorial plaque that marked the spot where Marcus Thompson had first heard the hollow sound that changed everything. The plaque bore the simple inscription, "Truth will come to light." Luke 8 verse 17, but beneath those words was an understanding that had been paid for with years of pain, courage, and the hard work of rebuilding trust. The secret room beneath the church floor was gone, sealed forever beneath concrete and marked only by that simple plaque. But the room had served its purpose in the end, not as Morrison had intended, as a place to hide his crimes, but as God had ultimately used it, as a catalyst for truth, justice, and the transformation of an entire community. 5 years later, the terrifying discovery beneath the church floor had indeed revealed the worst of what one person could do with unchecked authority. But it had also revealed the best of what a community could become when it chose courage over comfort, truth over secrecy, and healing over hiding. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest miracle of all.